Transatlantic. We crossed the English Channel 21 times, wearing and tracking, and saw the Casquettes and Portland Bill so often that I began to think them the beginning and the end of the world. In the early mornings and the night watches we had often to use flares to scare off steamers that weren't looking where they were going. In any sailing ship, navigation in these days, powered vessels are one of the major dangers. They and their officers have so long become used to an ocean in which the absence of masthead lights suggests that there are no vessels about, that they never look for the colored sidelights of sailing ships. The only lights which by international regulation ships which use only sail for motive power are allowed, so one has to keep wary lookout for them and have some good flares handy in the chart house to burn. There is nothing like a sudden flare beneath his nose to scare a blundering tramp out of the way. He thinks it is the land we narrowly escaped from beneath, the bows of 4 of them going down the channel, and the weather was not at all thick. We had had the same experience in the Parma, the Herzogen, Sicile, in all ships. It is the same in the Rio Lane on the line. Look out there. The big meat liners and the mail ships, tearing up from the plate, give little thought to the possibility of full-rig ships and 4-masted barks working through the doldrums. Fortunately for the square-rigged ship, she makes most of her voyaging far from steamer lanes. It is safer that way. We saw a 4-masted bark outward bound in ballast to Australia, beating off Dungeness, and passed her there. This surprised me, for I could see she was one of the crack Germans, Priwall or Padois, but we were able to make better boards and stand in towards the smoothness near the land to go round, tacking and gaining. She kept a good offing and wore round, but given one touch of fair wind she would be past us like a liner. I discovered later that we beat this big ship out of the channel by 3 days, but she was ahead of us 5 days at Madeira. In the narrow waters I took what chances I considered safe in order to gain the open sea more quickly. I looked upon the ship as a very small and almost as handy, so far as getting out of places went, as a schooner. I learned better later on. Handy she certainly was and weatherly, but I learned gradually to look upon her as a big ship so far as her handling went. It was curious how the grain ship sailors had come aboard and, running in the rigging, laughed to reach the royal yards by standing on the topgallants, and grinned with delight at the smallness of everything, toy-like almost after such giants as the 3,000-ton Parma and the big bark Penang. "What bottle did you get her out of?" yelled young Hilgard when he had come over from Landome. Not he, but 1 or 2 of the others, who had been only in grain ships, were frankly a little scared at the idea of so small a vessel setting out on a circumnavigation. For many days we tossed and fumed around, and the motion of the ship in the short sea was turbulent and violent. It was cold, and the 'tween decks where the boys lived were a wet hell, housing a sodden and saddened collection of bewildered youthful humanity facing up to its first experience. Of realities of life facing up very well. My boys were all right, though most of them were green with seasickness, and wet and cold, and we were long out of the channel before they had finally got it clear in their minds to which watches they belonged. We had passed the Ushant before some of them knew there were any watches, but they always showed up for their turns. I began at once the normal sea routine of the ship, knowing that a week of bad weather at the start will teach youngsters far more than they might learn in a year of trade wind Sundays afterwards. They came for their schooling at the wheel and in the rigging, green as they were, and there was no hanging back. I had then, and for a long time afterwards, until we were at last on the road to Cape Horn from Tahiti, almost 2 years later. A difficult problem in that many of the boys, particularly the older ones, did not want to be sailors. A few had come from mistaken ideas of romance and adventure, expecting these to be served up to them with the ship or with their meals, not knowing that they must be dug with difficulty deep down from themselves if the digging is sufficiently laborious and never discouraged and the soil is good enough. One or two had discovered their desire for adventure, I suspected from motives that were scarcely credible to themselves. It soon became obvious that, while never serious, human problems would be my most worrying ones. They were, it turned out, on that passage and throughout the voyage. Selecting the personnel for such a voyage, even if done by the Archangel Gabriel, would still be a gamble, and the devil himself could scarcely pick an entirely harmonious gang from the colossal amount of material at his disposal. I had had very largely to take what offered, but I had done very well. True, I harbored then, and once again later, one or two despicable characters, but these quickly departed, and what they had to do and to say did not matter very much. My crew was a good crew, and my boys were all right. Two days after leaving, I heard on my small wireless set in the saloon of two men who had flown from Mildenhall to Melbourne in an airplane in 3 days. We had left at the weekend of the England to Melbourne Centenary Air Race. I heard their speeches and the shouting on the air from Melbourne. We were not then come to St. Catherine's, and was to read the poor fellow's obituaries in an old newspaper before we were a year out and had still half the world before us. This doubtless was great progress, but they will be dead so long. There was much satisfaction in our leisurely wandering along, antiquated, primitive, and 100 years behind the times as we were. I do not see that so much of what we are taught to regard as progress matters in our daily lives. We should have had more comfort if the ship had been fitted with a heating system, and better meals if she had carried an electric refrigerating plant. But we did without those things and never missed them. There are many things in life today which, so far as I could see, add only to our worries and speed the grave. The spurious softening of living and the abolition of labor can be achieved largely only by some species of dope radio to dull our minds, canned food to dull our stomachs, fast transport to carry us quickly from offices where the raucous telephone rings all day, and all kinds of trivialities pass as toil, to our heated homes where we take laxatives or whatever else may seem helpful at the moment. But I had a ship to sail. I was and am no philosopher. I could leave these things behind. A pot had fallen on the cook's head in the galley, and I had to sew the cut. This I did without anesthetics and such things, and he did not mind. The spray was in his face, and the sea air filled his lungs. He went on with his work. After the Channel, Biscay was kind, though it was November when we reached those parts, and their name is bad. But we stormed from Ushant almost to Finisterre at 10 knots, which was good speed for the little vessel. The sea was not great, and the wind blew a fresh wholesale breeze that gave us our best sailing conditions. I headed towards the south, for I meant to go westwards by the southern route, kinder to ship and to crew. There is nothing gained by punching into the westerly gales of the North Atlantic in midwinter. The passage to New York is better made by going southwards to the trades and then running westwards with a fair wind. Columbus had gone west that way, though he had had the further advantage of starting in mild latitudes. All our early sailing commerce went that way, the first deep water sailing route commonly used by Europeans. Yachts and small vessels, whose crossings are more frequent than the landsman would suppose, also use this route. The early voyagings of small and somewhat ill-found vessels become more easily understood when one has followed in their tracks. The distance is doubled, of course, but the time may be halved. While we crossed the Atlantic in the outskirts of the trade wind zone, fierce gales raged on the steamer lanes, and 4 large steamers foundered there that winter. We had bad weather only at the beginning and the end, enough of it then, to be sure, but there was more than a month of mildness in between. Off Finisterre, in an electric squall, the long jib boom carried away at the cap. The squall was quickly passed, and we saved the wreckage of the boom, scarfed it, and rigged it out again. It had been too long for the deep water. The shortening of the boom, though unexpected, was no disadvantage, but really a strengthening. I noticed that the ship tacked better with the shorter boom. The evening before this squall, a Danish steamer named Lily, waddling northwards from somewhere in Spain with a high cargo of esparto grass, came over to us, and a big man shouted from her bridge, "Is that the old George stage?" as if he were amazed to see the old school ship there, and could scarce believe his eyes. I told him we were, and he blew a greeting on his siren and departed. There must be 4,000 Danes somewhere who were trained in this ship. On the bridge of all steamers, under that red and white ensign, there probably walks at least one mariner who first heard the curses of a mate round these docks and turned out to the shrill scream of the boatswain's pipe at 5:30 in the morning. So long as we were in the steamer lanes, I saw the Danish motor ships and steamers pause in their stride as they sighted us, and edge over nearer to see their old familiar Baltic friend driving through the Atlantic in her 53rd year. Good old ship, they held, and with their shouted blessings hurried on, smoke rack and floundering screws, and their black bulks dipping and rolling. At Madeira, a Dane and a small tug passing by hailed us and shouted, "Is that the old George stage?" And a diver working in Nassau Harbor later looked up startled from his breathing spell as we came in and yelled in Danish, "I'll go to hell, the old George stage," and sat in his little workboat a long time staring. And at Bay Ridge, when we were on the rocks, 300 elderly Danes came down to gaze upon their old vessel, and more than half of them came aboard. At Rio and the Cape it was the same. All round the world there came old Danes to gaze in quiet salute at the little ship which for so long had been well loved in their far waters. There was no mistaking her, of course, for no other vessel, frigate, rigged, has sailed the deep sea in 50 years. When I left England, I had no intention of calling at Madeira. Looking upon all deviations and unnecessary calls at ports as breaking the sea routine and lengthening the voyage. The time to stop at islands was in the Pacific, not the North Atlantic, and I was of the opinion that, so brief a way on our journey, some of the young gentlemen would not be sufficiently settled down to wish to continue the voyage. If they stayed for the trade wind run, I knew their hearts would be conquered, and I could count on them to the end. In a ship calling for such skillful handling and competence of manpower, I did not wish to be changing either my cadets or my crew. It was hard enough to train boys, willing as they were. When they were trained, I wished to keep them, but a fine old gentleman who had come from America to sample square rig with us had quickly discovered that the motion was too much for him, and at his own desire I went into Madeira to land him. I need not have worried about the boys. I gave them shore leave, and they came back well satisfied with themselves, converted in 2 weeks into extremely youthful ancient mariners, gazing with scorn upon the anchored steamers in the Funchal roads, and I had no applications to leave. Madeira was my first landfall. I was glad to make it. There is a quiet joy in seeing the land where one hoped it was, after days of sailing. This was the first time I had conducted a ship across great waters. The days before the landfall were thick with rain, and there were few glimpses of the obscured and watery sun, yet I got what data I could from the unwilling heavens, and stood on. And there upon the 19th morning rose the heights of Madeira pleasantly before us. I looked upon the place with great delight, put my sextant in its case that morning with a new regard, and looked affectionately at the chronometer ticking in its stand on the saloon table. I sailed towards Funchal roads between the Desertas and Madeira, and hoped that some officials would come out so that I could land my passenger without anchoring and further delay, but no one came. The morning was quiet, with little wind. The sea off Madeira is deep for anchoring. I did not want to go too close in, as I had to get under way again as quickly as possible, and I did not want to hire any tugs. The ancient semi-diesel engine was in its almost permanent state of hopeless breakdown. As no one came out, though I flew signals, I stood into the roads and let go the anchor near the hulk of the four-masted bark Gulmarn, and some hours afterwards 2 gentlemen came out who were officials of sorts, and brought with them an agency fee and a bill for pilotage. Where was the pilot or the need for him? They explained apologetically that there was only the bill. It was an old custom of the port, apparently. In such circumstances you pay and try to like it. There is nothing else to do. Afterwards came ship chandlers, a wine merchant, bumboats. We bought bananas and all kinds of tropical fruit. I took in some fresh food, and after the afternoon's leave, we sailed in the evening, going out very quietly with a gentle land breeze. The next morning Madeira was still in full sight. We wandered very slowly on our way. Soon enough we had the northeast trade, and stood westwards in the wake of Columbus towards Watling Island in the Bahamas, more than 3,000 miles away. The wind was quiet for the most part, and often fluky, but the days passed pleasantly, and all hands settled down properly to the routine of the voyage. The sun shone, and the flying fish skimmed away before our bows, and the boys slung their hammocks on deck, She rolled heavily at times with the wind almost aft, but this was great square rig sailing, and we averaged over 150 miles a day under every stitch of canvas. I bent all the old sails now, and the sailmaking gang worked steadily sewing new sails for the bad weather of the far south. We cut and sewed all our own canvas, did all our own work. I had a carpenter who was also a blacksmith and tinsmith. We had a forge and made a proper workshop in the 'tween decks. I had taken rope and paint and canvas for 2 years, and a good supply of all the tools that we might need, and some balks of timber for spare spars. We were, as far as possible, self-contained, except for fresh water, of which we could carry easily sufficient for 35 persons for 3 months. We were stored to keep the sea without touching land for 6 months, if necessary. The food was plain and of the old-fashioned seagoing variety. I had bought all the different kinds of preserved and tinned foods I thought might be palatable and useful, but our mainstay was the old salt junk, beef, and pork. This did not always appeal to the more fastidious and to those who had not learned that in some ways old manners are best. The modern tinned foods, if used continuously over too long a period, are insufficient. Meat for longer voyages is better preserved in saltpetre and brine. We had casks of salt beef and salt pork, bales of dried fish, potatoes in quantity. We baked fresh bread each day. I had a steward and a cook, and they were always busy. Various kinds of preserved meats and fish and other foods, judiciously assorted with the boiled salt meats and strong pea soup and boiled dried fish, made up the most of the meals. The food was ample if plain, and if there were no luxuries, there was at least a 3-course meal for everybody in the middle of the day. The galley stove never heated any pot that was not shared by all hands. There were no petty distinctions. I had long had some ideas of my own for the improved running of British ships, and here I had a chance to try them. I cut out all wretched discrimination between crew and cabin stores, which, in the lime-juice ships I had sailed in as a boy, was carried to ridiculous lengths. We lived alike in the Joseph Conrad fore and aft. The kids for 'tween decks and mess were filled from the same pot. There had to be rations of a few things, such as sugar and milk and jam. The provision room was too small to hold all the jam that 20 healthy boys could eat in 6 months. I had long held a theory that the few miserable pounds saved on food in most ships was well rated among the most stupid economies on earth, but how much of this went to the ship owners and how much was due to the skullduggery of stewards I could not say. If this comparatively small sum were spent instead of saved, the benefits in the way of better conditions for seafarers, and better health and more contentment, and better work all round would be almost incalculable. I spent it. I never tried to save a penny on the food. I never cut down anything, though many times on that long voyage I did not see how I could beat the bailiff out of the next port. I never stinted the food or the ship's stores in any manner. They were sufficient at all times. Perhaps the boys, on apple pie days and the like, scarcely agreed with this, but even his own mother cannot satisfy a boy with apple pie if he happens to like it. We had apple pie once weekly, and pancakes with jam twice for sweets. There were bacon and eggs on Sunday mornings, and nourishing soups we served up daily, tomato, vegetable, meat extract. The bully beef was warmed up and prepared in such a variety of ways that a meal of plain cold corned beef with pickles and tomato sauce on Sunday evenings came to be looked on almost as a luxury, so great a change was it. Tinned fish I used sparingly, not caring for the stuff. There is nothing of which the palate palls so quickly and so heartily. I found tinned vegetables nourishing and good, and carried a lot of tinned beetroot, bacon and beans, curry and rice, porridge with tinned liver and bacon. These were good breakfasts. There was always all the toast that anyone wanted, so long as they made it themselves. The midday meal was most substantial. In the evenings we had hash or fish cakes, or some kind of tinned stuff, such as stewed steak, put up in Melbourne, and very good, or boiled rabbit with tomato, or fish balls from Stavanger, or salmon made into a savory stew. Now and again there were rock buns made by the cook, to round out an evening meal of salt beef and boiled peas, and every afternoon at 3:30 there was a half-hour for coffee in the cold weather, and tea in the tropics. What afternoon tea! I see 10,000 ancient mariners turn contemptuously in their shrouds. But why not? Are sailors not human? This slight fact appears to me to have been overlooked for some centuries. There was a reason for our afternoon coffee. One of my innovations in this ship was the scrapping of the eternal 4-on, 4-off watch system. I should have liked to use the 3-watch style, dividing the crew into 3 sections, each of which would work 4 hours and then rest 8. But I had not enough to do this, so I divided up the day in a manner of my own, based largely upon my experience in the grain ships from Australia. We had 2 watches, port the mates, and starboard the second mates. From midnight to midnight, the day was divided into only 5 watches: midnight to 4, 4 to 8 a.m., 8 a.m. to 1 p.m., 1 p.m. to 7 p.m., and 7 p.m. to midnight. In this manner, one watch had 10 hours on deck one day and 14 the next, alternating. The watch with the long afternoon on deck were given the half-hour for coffee to break the watch. So there was no hardship, even in the worst weather, and this system of watches worked very well. I also sent all hands to the wheel, from the youngest boy to the oldest, A.B., and gave them hour turns each instead of the more usual 2 hours. 2 hours is too long for a young boy, sleepy and cold in the middle of the night. It is often necessary in steamers, where the watches frequently consist only of 2 helmsmen, relieving one another, but in a sailing ship there are plenty of hands for the wheel. I saw that the quarters fore and aft were kept as well as they could possibly be. She was an old ship built for the Baltic, and when she was launched there was not much concern about ventilation. This was a drawback which nothing but considerable structural alteration could improve, and for this I had neither time nor money. We compromised by sleeping and living in the open air as much as possible. The boys at first slept in hammocks. As soon as possible I built them proper bunks. A hammock is an impersonal sort of thing which, when stowed away, leaves one with a vague feeling of having no home in the ship, no little nook of one's own. A bunk is yours, inviolate. There you may put up your photographs from home, or other ships, and a girl friend, maybe, and cunningly contrive little shelves and holdalls and things, and rig up a curtain for your privacy. You may lie in state a moment or two before taking the well-earned rest of your watch below, and pridefully survey the that holds your fids and your spike and your sail needles, and the little shelf of much-thumbed books, casting an eye briefly upon the picture of your last ship. At least this is what deep-sea sailors in sailing ships have always done. Some of my college boys later on so filled their bunks with junk that there was no room for themselves, and they slept on deck or sprawled over a couple of wooden chests. But for the Atlantic crossing there were no college boys. The boys looked after their own quarters, taking weekly turns. They were not waited on. Some of them, before they came, had only just managed to wash themselves. Many of them knew nothing of life without home comforts, but they learned indeed very well. There were some who moaned in the process, loud and long, but to grumble has always been the seafarer's privilege. By and large the ship settled down very well. I knew I had tried a pretty big thing, taking this ship of youth round the world. I knew that if I could not hold them together, nothing and nobody could help me. Most of the cadets had paid. I took the view that if they did not wish to be seamen and came in my ship for the benefit of the voyage, it was fair enough that they should contribute something towards the expenses of the voyage. I made this amount low, considering that I had to train them, that their work was of little or no value to the vessel or the enterprise, and I had to keep them for 2 years all around the world. I deliberately made the payment low in order that there could be no suggestion of a cooperative enterprise about the voyage. This was a ship bound seriously upon a voyage, useless or not. We were not a band of idle wanderers, each contributing his fair share towards the cost of the voyage, all members of a kind of debating committee, deciding what should be done. Ships that set out in this manner, and some do not usually proceed very far. If there was one thing I knew thoroughly before all else, it was just this, that ships and the sea are not to be fooled with, lest they kill you. There was no debating committee. I should very much have preferred to have taken all poor boys, or at any rate to have chosen my boys regardless of the question of funds. But I did take as many of these as I could well afford, and my philanthropy, as it was, landed me in financial difficulties more than once. I had no spare penny that whole voyage, and could never hope at any time to do anything other than barely square the ledger after years of writing and hard work, and I could have asked for greater sums and secured them easily enough, but this I was stubbornly against. There must be no slightest suggestion of profit-making, of gain, even of making the cadetships pay. This indeed, as a moment's reflection or the slightest knowledge of ship's cost will show, would have been quite impossible unless I had taken 20 boys and charged them $200 a year. And the more boys one has, the more trouble. They are expert in the avoidance of work and the destruction of the ship's gear. But I liked them for all that, and I knew I had hit upon the best possible use for the ship when I threw her open to cadets. My idea originally had been to make the rich cadets support the poor ones, without the knowledge of either naturally, and to some extent this worked. But before very long I was supporting both of them, so far as the upkeep of the ship was concerned. We had school every day, but it was different school from any ashore. There were lessons in splicing and knots and bends, and all kinds of plating work, in sail sewing and kringle making, in making eyes in wire and turning in the seam of a ditty bag, in seizing and rackings and marryings of all kinds, all up in the sunshine of the open foresail head, with the long jib boom reaching over the Atlantic waves, and the sea foam turned from the old cutwater scintillating in the warm air. There were lessons in reefing, in the loosing in stowing of sails, in sending up and down masts and yards, in the general and difficult art of ship handling, but ship construction and cargo work were not in our curriculum. As far as possible, the work was practical. The cadets in their watches joined in the whole of the ship's work. There was an hour for lessons in each deck watch, and for the rest of the 4 or 6 hours they turned to on whatever was going. They chipped and scraped and painted, they scrubbed down and tarred and they greased. They took their lookouts and their police and their wheels. When it was calm enough they swam, or we swung out the lifeboats and went rowing. For swimming there was always a masthead lookout to watch for sharks. In such manner the days passed. Sometimes the trade wind was fresh, and sometimes it was poor. More often it was poor. One week we made only 400 miles. Sometimes there were rain squalls and calms. When it rained we caught fresh water and all hands washed. We had one full week of glorious sailing when the ship ran 1,300 miles to 1060 in 5 days. She ran along bravely under a full press of sail, with the sea big and the sky overcast and a great wake of foam trailing off astern. She set with her trade wind suit some 10,000 feet of canvas, which was a lot for a ship 100 feet long, but she stood up to it very well. She was beautifully proportioned and rolled with an easy grace. She had 100 tons of inside ballast and a deep keel that was not weighted. She had a hull driven easily through the water. In light winds she readily made 5 knots, and with any freshening came quickly up to 7 and 8. She had to be driven a little to get over 10, but on one of these 5 days she ran 260 miles. This was the first day of the strong trade, when the sea had not had time to rise. It was pretty fine then to walk the decks and watch the run of her and listen to the driving spray and look aloft at the pyramids of masts carrying their spread of graceful canvas swollen in the sky, and to watch the long roll of her golden trucks beneath the stars. The youthful helmsmen at the wheel found her easy and hummed softly to themselves as she ran, and the lookouts sang, and the grain ship sailors opened their eyes a little and said to one another, "God, this is sailing. This is almost as good as the Parma or the Penang or the Olive Bank," or whatever other ship happened to be their favorite. Previously, 1 or 2 of them had been rather scornful of the sailing qualities of the little vessel. Well, they saw a lot before that voyage was over, for the Joseph Conrad made all her long ocean runs in times at least as good as the average grain ships could make, not the crack big 4-masters, of course, but the barks Killaron and Winterhood, and the ship Grace Harwar, and the barkentine Mozart, all of which were at least 10 times her size. So we came at last 30 days out of Madeira, almost to Watling Island, where it is generally agreed that Columbus made his first landfall. Near here the northeast trade departed and did not come back again. The conditions became baffling, with sudden mildish storms alternating with brief periods of calm, and the sea confused with a swell from all directions, and the ship lolling about and falling this way and that. Watling Island, or San Salvador, which also appears to be its name, is lit now and is an important signpost on the cargo ship's track from Panama Canal to the eastern seaboard of America. It is a low, dullish place seen from the sea, and after looking at it for some days with baffling conditions and almost no progress, I did not care about it half as much as Columbus had done. It is rather difficult in these days to recapture the spirit of these old navigators when the wearied Atlantic air is filled nightly with the raucous shouts of gentlemen glibly retailing the world's news, poor tidings mainly calamitous, according to them, and divers persons with insinuating silver tongues advising American children aged 4 to purchase portable typewriters, or reading out the letters of a mother within the Arctic Circle, extolling the effects of a laxative on her child. The air is full of noise, and nothing is said. The human has conquered space to shout of body odor and its own incompetence. Of course, I could turn the radio off, but sometimes there is good music, and if one listens long enough with sufficient grim determination, there are sometimes time signals and weather reports. A Mitsui motor ship, very smart and modern, with her name along her side in white letters, 2 fathoms high, and 2 tramps and an oil tanker waddle by. We see the lighthouse and the breakers and all the quays, and the wreck of what appears to be a bark close inshore. We remained in sight of Watling Island for 3 days. At last we came past, after much beating, and stood onwards towards Cat Island and Eleuthera and the great Abaco, meaning to pass between the last named and Egg Island towards New Providence, where Nassau is. I had no reason for going into Nassau, other than to break the passage and give some diversion to those who were with us only for the Atlantic run. The ship was short of nothing, and could as easily have gone on to New York, but I had promised to go there, and so we went. We were 35 days out of Madeira before the Fincastle light at last showed up. It was night, and no pilot came, for these gentlemen are nowadays ordered by wireless, and at the smaller ports little lookout is kept for visual signals. I stood on gingerly towards the outer anchorage, not daring to go in. This was my first tropic island, my first reef. How ominous was the sound of the breakers as we approached. I was not used to this, or port makings had not been of this kind in the grain ships. At midnight of the 16th of December, the sights of Nassau seemed mighty close. I stood on, and the breakers roared more and more loudly in my ears, and I sounded and found no bottom. It was an anxious anchorage, sounding, no bottom, with the deep sea lead at 100 fathoms out once every 5 minutes, and the ship going quietly on under easy sail, and the sailing directions West Indies pilot, volume 111, in every paragraph, on every page, exhorting the mariner to caution and speaking of danger, and the breakers roaring on the white sand that now looked so perilously close. Vessels should proceed under easy sail and be ready to anchor at any instant, says the pilot, and under easy sail we drifted to leeward away from the anchorage with the tide setting us down. The pilot said nothing about that. Rocky, uneven ground, said the chart. No bottom, said the lead. Caution, said the pilot. Inside the harbor was a narrow, dredged channel leading to the only good anchorage in there. It was senseless to go inside without a local pilot, and none came. I did the only wise thing I could, for the weather was good, headed onwards for the breakers, and found an anchorage at last. There we rolled quietly in safety through the night. In the morning I saw the beach a few hundred yards away, and the wreck of a steamer close. The pilot came, and we went in and anchored in the Hurricane Hole, and the colored minstrels came, playing their guitars, and there was a tourist liner at the wharf. Nassau is a tourist place these days, with expensive hotels and glass-bottomed boats and guides and all that stuff. And when we came in, there was a big golf tournament in progress to attract visitors from Florida. American airliners come down daily with cargoes of millionaires seeking a change of scene, and the great steamships from New York disgorge tourists by the thousand whenever they can find them. I did not see much to keep me in such a place, for it was not interesting, and it was the most expensive as far as the ship was concerned. Of the whole voyage, more expense by far even than to Lagi and Samari in the Pacific, where there was some excuse for high food prices. In the great hotel overlooking the harbor, I saw a tableau showing a pirate putting away some gold. Somehow this struck me in those surroundings as a little too frankly apt. Nassau was the headquarters of piracy once. It seemed to me it still is. I prefer the older kind myself. I might have joined the pirates. The boys had leave, each watch a day, and enjoyed themselves well enough. I went alongside and took in water and departed after 3 days. The cook was run over by a horse, he said, in Nassau's main street, and held the ship up half an hour while he was patched in a chemist's shop. But I found out afterwards he had been racing along the sands on some thoroughbred with young Tilbury, and had come a cropper. A queer cuss, the cook. I don't know where they got the thoroughbreds, and did not stop to inquire. We sailed, and our departing passengers followed us to sea in a motorboat taking photographs. Most of them left Nassau. We were bound now to New York in the depths of winter, and soon it would be icy cold. It was the first week or so was warm enough, but once we had crossed the Gulf Stream, the weather became bitter at once. We had Christmas in a blow off Hatteras, with the mess room decorated with a tree made of painted wood and canvas, and hung with the 7 flags of our 7 nationalities, and there was tinned plum pudding with brandy sauce, and the cook had made mince pies pretty good, and with full bellies all hands were happy enough. We had bad weather from Hatteras to New York, strong northwest gales and bitter cold. The ship was iced up, and work on deck was purgatory. The foresail head was iced so badly the lookout could not stay there. There was ice in the foot ropes and all the blocks, and reefing was no fun. It blew a gale strength frequently, but we beat along. We saw steamers daily now, iced up as we were, and envied them their fires. And then one day a piece of some Long Island beach, I never discovered which it was, for I had been going by dead reckoning for days, showed up before the bows with a motor car rushing up and down honking. There was just time to go round and stand clear of that danger. The same evening we were in the New York liner lane with the Saturday afternoon line of steamships coming out, one behind the other in a long row, and the Ambrose light blinked a cold welcome. It still blew heavily from the northwest, but I held to a press of sail for fear of being blown out into the Atlantic again. The fearful cold robbed us of the pleasure of seeing the light, and the night was misery. In the morning the pilot steamer came, and the pilot was on board, a cheerful cove named Kiernan, and we beat in, though the wind was still strong from ahead, and anchored on the 30th of December, 1934, on the flats in Sandy Hook Bay. We were 70 days from Harwich, of which 67 had been spent at sea, and we had sailed 7,014 miles. The voyage had had its anxieties, but the Atlantic was behind us now. The Lord had been kind to us, and I was feeling rather pleased.